Right now, something astonishing is unfolding in the skies above us. For months, astronomers had been tracking 3I/Atlas, the interstellar comet that entered our solar system in July 2025, its hyperbolic path carrying it past the sun and out again toward deep space. At first, it seemed like the usual story, another mysterious outsider, like Oumuamua in 2017 or Borisov in 2019, here to remind us that our solar system is not an isolated bubble, but just one stop on a galactic freeway. Yet what has happened since late September is unlike anything ever recorded. The story isn't about 3I/Atlas alone anymore. It's about what is following it, what is multiplying around it, as though the comet were seeding space with alien companions. Observations from NASA's NEOWISE, ESA's Gaia probe, and amateur backyard telescopes all report the same thing: strange, faint, tumbling objects appearing in the comet's wake, their trajectories oddly synchronized, their brightness fluctuating in a way that suggests not simple icy fragments, but something more structured, more engineered. By early October, the Minor Planet Center had cataloged no fewer than 47 new unidentified objects traveling in loosely parallel paths, each one less than 100 meters in size, but reflecting sunlight with an albedo higher than any known asteroid. Scientists immediately scrambled to explain the impossible multiplication. Was 3I/Atlas simply fragmenting under thermal stress, shedding chunks of volatile ice and rock as comets do near perihelion? Or was this something unprecedented, matter behaving in ways no earthly chemistry could predict? The reflectivity alone set off alarms. Most comet fragments are jet black, darker than charcoal, their albedo hovering around 0.04. These newcomers gleamed like polished metal, their brightness ratios reaching 0.7, closer to stainless steel than to ice. And yet their infrared signatures betrayed almost no thermal emission, as if they weren't absorbing sunlight at all. This contradiction was so severe that senior astronomers at the European Southern Observatory privately confessed they felt they were looking at something artificial. More troubling still, the objects did not simply disperse like comet fragments normally do. Instead, they seemed to maintain spacing, clustering into geometric configurations reminiscent of loose grids or swarms. On October 3rd, data from the Subaru telescope in Hawaii revealed that 9 of the objects had arranged themselves in a pattern, forming a near-perfect arc, trailing the comet by 8,000 kilometers. Coincidence, perhaps, or orbital dynamics too complex for human intuition, but the human brain, always wired to see intent in patterns, could not ignore the possibility of control. The news never made the evening broadcasts. Agencies downplayed it as a fragmentation anomaly. But among professionals, the whispers grew louder. What if 3I/Atlas was not just an interstellar comet? What if it was carrying something with it? Seeds, machines, or probes that only revealed themselves when it approached a star? After all, even our own Voyager and Pioneer spacecraft, tiny emissaries of human civilization, are drifting out toward the interstellar medium. Who is to say that other civilizations might not have sent their own? And if so, what exactly had just multiplied around Mars's orbital path, gleaming like alien satellites, waiting in silence for our telescopes to notice? By mid-October, as 3I/Atlas drew nearer to the orbit of Mars, the multiplication accelerated. Reports from the Chinese Fast Radio Telescope detected anomalous radar echoes near the comet, scattered returns inconsistent with natural debris fields, as though dozens of solid bodies were bouncing signals back in ways that suggested smooth surfaces. The count of strange companions ballooned from dozens to over 200, each one moving with eerie precision as though the comet were a shepherd guiding its flock, and their positions relative to Mars became increasingly alarming. Several of the objects adjusted their orbits to pass near the red planet within weeks, a maneuver so improbable that even cautious scientists began to admit the word unnatural. To put this into perspective, natural fragmentation follows predictable dynamics: gravity, solar radiation, and outgassing jets. The fragments scatter randomly, diverging with time, but these new objects converged. They clustered closer as the comet neared Mars, their density increasing, their patterns more distinct. A paper rushed onto Arxiv by a team at Caltech outlined the math. The probability of over 200 independent fragments adopting near-synchronous Mars-crossing trajectories was less than 1 in 10 billion. Something was directing this. The data only grew stranger. The Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter captured faint glints on its high-resolution cameras, reflections pulsing rhythmically as if sunlight was being caught and released by spinning facets. When analysts slowed the footage, they discovered the glints repeated in intervals of exactly 131 seconds. That kind of regularity had no precedent in cometary science. It was as though the objects were signaling, blinking in unison, performing a cosmic countdown. Panic remained hidden from the public eye, but the Pentagon's Space Command quietly raised the alert level, issuing classified advisories about non-random orbital anomalies. The European Space Agency's tracking software flagged potential intersections with Mars's thin upper atmosphere in early November. If even a fraction of these objects entered the Martian sky, the spectacle would be visible from Earth, a wave of burning streaks, or perhaps if the objects survived entry, impacts on the Martian surface. Already, rovers like Perseverance and orbiters like Maven had been tasked to monitor, though their instruments were never designed for this. The speculative possibilities grew darker. What if these were not fragments at all, but probes designed to activate under stellar heating, spreading to planetary bodies as spores spread to fertile ground? The eerie regularity of the 131-second flashes haunted every analysis, conjuring thoughts of machines awakening after eons of dormancy. And yet the silence was total. No radio signals, no obvious propulsion, no detectable power signatures. Just mute, multiplying companions swarming around an interstellar visitor as it swept past Mars. For the first time since its discovery, the scientific consensus fractured. Some insisted this was extreme, but natural physics, cometary material, under stresses beyond our comprehension. Others whispered that this was the first undeniable evidence of an alien presence in our solar system. Either way, the truth was the same. Something unprecedented was happening right now, unfolding over Mars, and humanity could do nothing but watch, speculate, and wonder whether we were witnessing the opening act of contact or invasion. By October 21st, the swarm no longer looked like a scatter of fragments. Instead, telescopes on Earth and orbiters around Mars began to resolve something far more disturbing: order. The so-called Atlas fragments were no longer dispersing chaotically as natural debris fields do. They were converging into formations that seemed geometric, arrays, lattices, shapes that evoked architecture rather than accident. The Subaru telescope in Hawaii captured long-exposure images showing faint trails arranged not randomly, but in straight, nearly parallel lines. When overlaid, the trajectories suggested equilateral spacing, as if each object were maintaining a fixed position relative to the others. This was impossible under the rules of normal celestial mechanics. Gravity and radiation pressure scatter fragments, they don't stabilize them into patterns. Even more bizarrely, the formations shifted over time, as though adjusting like a flock of starlings twisting in response to invisible signals. Data from ESA's Mars Express orbiter revealed one arrangement resembling a hexagonal lattice trailing the comet by 40,000 kilometers. A hexagon, repeating with nearly perfect symmetry, its angles deviating by less than 2 degrees from mathematical precision. No natural force in space carves hexagons from debris, not at that scale. The comparison to Saturn's polar hexagon, a storm structure maintained by atmospheric resonance, was inevitable, but here there was no atmosphere, no planetary vortex to shape the geometry, just cold vacuum and objects moving with eerie coordination, and the numbers grew worse. The initial 47 fragments catalogued in early October had now multiplied into over 300. Their albedo measurements remained anomalously high, 0.6 to 0.8, comma brighter than polished aluminum. Spectrographic analysis hinted at surfaces rich in nickel and chromium, metals resistant to solar heating, yet arranged in ratios that did not match any known meteorite class. On October 19th, the Chinese Chang'e 6 relay orbiter, positioned near lunar orbit, detected radar echoes bouncing in a peculiar synchronized rhythm, as though several objects were pulsing reflective surfaces in sequence. The pattern repeated every 19 minutes, too regular to be random. Analysts at JAXA and NASA privately admitted this could represent coordinated rotation, but whispers of synchronization grew louder. At Mars, the mystery deepened. MAVEN detected fluctuations in the upper atmosphere on October 20th, faint ionization spikes lasting only seconds, coinciding with the predicted passage of several swarm objects just skimming the edge of Martian space. Though too weak to classify as auroras, these ionization bursts hinted at interaction, as if the objects were deliberately sampling or probing the atmosphere. For planetary scientists, the implications were staggering. Were these things experimenting, testing entry? To make matters worse, the swarm's multiplication did not appear to result from simple splitting. High-resolution imaging suggested new objects were emerging whole, appearing where none had been before, as if birthed fully formed. The estimated population doubled every 6 days, an exponential curve that, if it continued, would yield thousands of objects by mid-November. One speculative model likened this to biological replication, comparing it to bacterial doubling rates. But biology doesn't explain nickel-chromium reflectors gleaming in Martian orbit. For the first time, government agencies admitted, behind closed doors, that they could not model the phenomenon. This is no longer astronomy. One ESA scientist was quoted in leaked emails. It's surveillance. We are being watched. The phrase stuck. For while the official story remained cometary fragmentation, the undeniable geometry, the synchronized flashes, and the exponential multiplication painted a far more chilling picture, a swarm not of debris, but of machines. By October 28th, the swarm had reached Mars in earnest. Hundreds of the objects now orbited the planet in loose belts, their reflective flashes visible even to Earth-based amateurs with high-end equipment. Mars had become a stage, and humanity was watching. The Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter transmitted images showing elongated shadows on the Martian surface as the objects passed overhead, some casting silhouettes far too regular, rectilinear, box-like to be dismissed as random chunks of ice. Perseverance's cameras, meant for geology, caught faint streaks overhead during twilight, their brightness pulsing in eerie synchrony, a cosmic heartbeat echoing across Jezero crater. Then came the first descent. On October 27th, Maven detected one of the swarm objects grazing the atmosphere at 92 kilometers altitude. Instead of burning up like ordinary debris, it flared bright emerald, then stabilized, maintaining velocity before curving back into orbit. It was as though the object had tested atmospheric entry, dipped into the thin Martian sky like a swimmer testing the water, then retreated. This was unprecedented. No known natural fragment behaves this way. Objects either skip once like stones on water, or they burn violently. But this thing controlled its descent. More followed. By October 29th, 5 additional swarm members had performed similar maneuvers, dipping into the Martian upper atmosphere before returning to orbit. Each time, Maven recorded ionization trails that lingered far longer than normal meteor traces, suggesting deliberate release of plasma or charged particles. The implications were terrifying, and if these objects could control entry into Mars's atmosphere, what stopped them from attempting the same with Earth when trajectories aligned? Military analysts ran simulations showing that if even a few dozen of these metallic shards entered Earth's skies intact, they could impact with energies rivaling nuclear warheads. Yet their behavior suggested reconnaissance, not aggression, at least not yet. Still, the Pentagon moved DARPA assets to deep space readiness, while Russia's Roscosmos hinted cryptically at anomalous threats in its official October 30th bulletin. As Halloween approached, conspiracy theories exploded online. Amateur astronomers posted grainy footage of blinking objects over Mars, comparing them to fleets of satellites. Hashtags like #Atlas, Swarm, and #Martian Lights trended worldwide. Governments downplayed, calling them ordinary comet fragments. But leaked audio from a NASA press room revealed what officials really thought. If these things start landing, one voice whispered, "We're not ready." And the final twist, on October 30th, the very day 3 I/Atlas itself reached perihelion. Hubble recorded the comet's coma surging in brightness, not from sunlight, but from within, a pulsing glow, cycling every 131 seconds, matching the flashes of the swarm. The implication was unavoidable. The comet and its multiplying companions were linked, communicating, or perhaps even one system. And now that system had reached Mars, surrounding it in orbit, dipping into its skies, multiplying exponentially. Something unprecedented was here, and for the first time in history, we were not just observing a comet, we were witnessing an arrival. By November 2nd, the Martian atmosphere had become a stage for phenomena no one on Earth was prepared to interpret. At least a dozen swarm objects were now observed, making what appeared to be deliberate, controlled descents through the planet's tenuous veil of carbon dioxide. Unlike meteors, which blaze in chaotic arcs before shattering into incandescent shards, these objects dipped smoothly, as though guided by invisible hands. The most dramatic case unfolded above Valles Marineris, the vast canyon system stretching over 4,000 kilometers across Mars's equator. Its scale is beyond ordinary comprehension, so immense that if it lay across Earth, it would stretch from New York to Los Angeles, swallowing mountain ranges and seas alike. Into this yawning scar, on November 2nd, a swarm object descended, tracked simultaneously by ESA's Mars Express, NASA's Maven, and multiple ground-based observatories back on Earth. The descent defied every law of celestial mechanics as we understand them. Entering the upper atmosphere at nearly 19 kilometers per second, the object should have ignited like a flare, plasma sheath forming at temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Celsius. Instead, the thermal profile remained unnervingly flat, registering a meager few hundred degrees, as though the object possessed a form of active cooling or a material immune to frictional heating. Maven recorded ionization trails. Yes, but unlike the random turbulence of meteor plasma, these trails pulsed rhythmically, precisely every 131 seconds, echoing the cosmic heartbeat that had haunted the swarm since its first multiplication. Scientists initially dismissed the timing as coincidence, but subsequent passes repeated the same pattern, exact to the millisecond. It was impossible to explain away. Worse still was the behavior inside the canyon airspace. For nearly 5 full minutes, the object held altitude, flying parallel to the canyon rim, with a steadiness more akin to a drone than a tumbling rock. It banked slightly, adjusted course, then accelerated back into orbit. No crash, no fragmentation, no randomness. Analysts at JPL admitted privately that this was survey-like behavior. The parallel course matched geological boundaries known to contain hydrated minerals and possibly subsurface ice. To human colonists, Valles Marineris has long been an object of desire, a possible cradle for future settlement. But now, something else, something interstellar was taking an interest. And the strangeness didn't stop there. When the object re-emerged into orbit, imaging from Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter suggested it had not remained solitary. What ascended was no longer one, it had divided. 2 objects traced identical arcs upward, maintaining perfect spacing as though tethered by invisible threads. Their reflective signatures matched to 6 decimal places, suggesting not fragmentation, but replication, an act of manufacture. This wasn't debris splitting like ice under stress. It was something generating copies of itself. DARPA officials coined a chilling phrase in response, von Neumann aerosats, a reference to the long-feared concept of self-replicating probes designed to spread like spores through the galaxy. The implications spiraled outward like wildfire. If one object could replicate an atmosphere, what stopped the others? Mars, with its weak gravity and thin atmosphere, was the perfect test bed, low entry stress, accessible surface chemistry, abundant dust and ice. A planetary laboratory. Meanwhile, amateur astronomers back on Earth began to detect strange green flickers in telescope feeds, coinciding with reported descents. Social media dubbed them space fireflies, and though the name seemed innocent, the reality was anything but. Each flicker represented a machine, multiplying itself on a world not our own. By November 3rd, at least 7 additional atmospheric passes were documented. Every one of them left Maven's sensors ringing with that same 131-second pulse, like a beacon, a signature, or a warning. Scientists who once laughed at speculation now whispered in private, "These things aren't falling, they're practicing." If November 2nd revealed controlled descents, November 5th brought something even more profound, a landing, not a crash, not a meteor impact, but a deliberate silent landing on the Martian surface. The event unfolded in Elysium Planitia, a region already famous as the landing site of NASA's InSight mission years earlier. Flat, relatively dust-free, and hiding ice beneath the regolith, Elysium has always been considered one of the best candidates for human outposts, and perhaps for that very reason it became the site of the first alien footprint. ESA's Trace Gas Orbiter detected anomalous dust plumes at coordinates 5° N, 150° E, faint, circular disturbances inconsistent with ordinary dust devils. Hours later, the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter's high-rise camera captured the clearest evidence yet, a symmetrical circular imprint in the soil, 10 meters across, surrounded by faint radial marks, suggestive of thruster descent. At the center sat something glinting, an object not of rock or dust but of geometry. A hexagon, 6 meters across, edges razor straight, corners perfect to within 1 arc-second of measurement. This was not a comet fragment. This was manufactured. The object's behavior post-landing only deepened the nightmare. At first it shone bright nickel, reflective and glaring against the red soil, but within hours its albedo changed. It darkened, becoming matte black, absorbing nearly all incoming light across visible and infrared bands. Spectroscopy suggested adaptive nanostructures, surfaces capable of tuning themselves for concealment. In other words, it could choose when to be seen. Thermal readings baffled analysts. It radiated no waste heat, even in the frigid Martian night. Either it was perfectly insulated, or it was dissipating energy in ways beyond human detection. And then came the multiplication. By November 7th, 3 days after touchdown, orbital images revealed that the single hexagon was no longer alone. 5 smaller objects appeared in a precise ring around it, each one approximately 2 meters across, arranged with mathematical exactitude in a nested hexagonal geometry. No descent was recorded, no new plumes were observed. They had simply appeared, as if grown from Martian soil or assembled out of unseen reserves carried within the first lander. Each pulsed faintly in the infrared, their signals synchronized at the dreaded 131-second rhythm. For the first time in history, humanity was watching an alien construction process unfold in real time on another planet. Governments scrambled to contain the data. NASA issued bland statements about surface anomalies. ESA called the structures imaging artifacts. But leaked memos painted a different reality. One internal JPL report warned, "We may be observing autonomous construction. Recommend reevaluation of planetary protection protocols. Risk of exponential settlement behavior cannot be discounted." Another from Roscosmos was even starker. "This is colonization activity. Their silence is intentional. The military took no chances. US plongos tenal. The US plongos tenal. The military took no chances. US plongos tenal. Space Command elevated alert status to DEFCON 3 for orbital assets, while China's CNSA redirected surveillance satellites for continuous monitoring. The fear wasn't merely that Mars was being seeded, it was that Earth might be next. Already over 500 objects swarmed in orbit around Mars. If even a fraction repeated the Elysium landing, whole regions of the red planet could be seeded with artificial colonies within months. Worse, the silence persisted. No radio signals, no communication, no explanation. Just the quiet pulse of machines arriving, multiplying and building. The chilling phrase spread through closed-door sessions at the United Nations. They are not visiting, they are settling. And as the world debated whether to admit what was happening, telescopes recorded the glint of more swarm members descending, heading for other Martian sites, other plains, other canyons. The first alien base on Mars had been built, not by human hands, but by machines that came hidden in the wake of an interstellar comet. And now it was spreading. By November 10th, the first signs emerged that the swarm, if that word even captured what was happening, was not simply settling Mars, but was now aware of us. The Martian rovers, Perseverance and Curiosity, along with orbiters like Maven and Mars Express, had been silently recording flickers, shadows, and inexplicable sensor readings for weeks. But on this day, the anomalies shifted from passive to active. Perseverance, still trundling dutifully across Jezero Crater, recorded an optical event no one could dismiss, a green flare in the sky that slowed, stabilized, and then hovered overhead for nearly 12 minutes, pulsing faintly at the now infamous 131-second interval. The rover's supercam microphone captured a faint, buzzing modulation riding atop the Martian wind, at first dismissed as static interference, until analysts discovered repeated in harmonic ratios consistent with prime numbers. Prime numbers, the mathematical language of intent. Curiosity, 3,700 kilometers away, recorded a different anomaly at nearly the same time, a sudden burst of infrared light directed downward, illuminating its mast cam like a spotlight before vanishing. It was as though the swarm objects were sweeping the surface, scanning, cataloging, perhaps even targeting. Maven, passing overhead, detected electromagnetic spikes coinciding with both rover anomalies, triangulating to swarm members in orbit. To the public, these were filed away as atmospheric effects. Behind closed doors, they were treated as the first clear indication of machine-to-machine attention. Humanity's emissaries on Mars, designed as our eyes and ears, had become the first points of alien observation. The psychological weight of this was devastating for scientists who had spent decades building those machines. They were not supposed to be seen. They were not supposed to be acknowledged. Yet now strange objects born of an interstellar comet's wake were circling above, pulsing their metallic heartbeat, shining light into our cameras, whispering prime numbers into our microphones. At JPL, one engineer muttered during a classified briefing, "They've noticed us. They know we're here." And if they knew the rovers were here, the question that chilled the room was inevitable. Did they also know that we were watching them from Earth? By November 14th, what had been whispers of pattern and rhythm became something undeniable, a signal. The Chinese Tianwen-Warren orbiter, still operational above Mars, recorded a narrow-band emission centered on 1420 MHz, the hydrogen line, a frequency long considered the universal hailing channel in SETI research. For decades, astronomers had assumed any intelligent broadcast would likely use this frequency, tied to the most abundant element in the universe. And now, above Mars, it appeared. The emission pulsed faintly, repeating every 131 seconds, but within the envelope of noise was structure, subtle modulations, shifts in amplitude, and phase that could not be explained by natural plasma or background cosmic hiss. When run through Fourier analysis, the signal collapsed into clean harmonics arranged in binary sequences: 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, prime numbers again. But more unsettling than the content was the source. Tianwen-1's instruments fixed the origin not to 3I/Atlas itself, but to one of the hexagonal constructs that had landed in Elysium Planitia. In other words, something on the Martian surface was broadcasting. ESA's trace gas orbiter confirmed the detection hours later, and Maven corroborated from a different orbital angle. 3 independent confirmations meant it was no longer deniable. Yet governments responded with silence, locking the data under classified seals while issuing vague statements about instrumental interference. But inside the agencies, panic was palpable. If these signals were intentional, they represented the first unambiguous act of communication from a non-human intelligence. and yet the messages were not directed to Earth. They were beamed upward toward the swarm still circling Mars. Analysts speculated this was intra-swarm coordination, a machine-to-machine protocol we had accidentally intercepted. Others suggested it was testing, probing whether our orbiters would notice. The possibility most feared, but left unsaid, was that the signal was bait, a demonstration designed to see how we would react. Across the world, SETI researchers begged to access the data, but it remained locked behind military firewalls. Still, fragments leaked, and when decoded crudely by amateurs, the patterns looked disturbingly like compressed images, rasterized grids that, when plotted, formed nothing recognizable, only jagged shapes resembling cellular structures or fractal machinery. Whether these were attempts at communication or simply alien machine chatter, never meant for our ears, no one could say. But one fact was clear. For the first time, Mars was not silent. Something there was speaking, pulsing a hydrogen-line heartbeat into the void, and humanity, caught listening, could only ask itself the oldest and most terrifying question. When they send signals to each other, are they whispering in peace, or are they plotting in war? By November 18th, Mars began to change. Subtle at first, like whispers in the data, then undeniable. Instruments aboard Maven, Mars Express, and Tianwen-1 all reported atmospheric anomalies across Elysium Planitia and Valles Marineris. Localized spikes of methane and oxygen, inexplicable ionization bursts, and temperature gradients rising far too quickly to be explained by dust storms or solar flux. The readings pointed not to chaos but to process, as though the swarm objects that had landed were deliberately altering their environment. Infrared images from Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter showed faint glows radiating from the hexagonal structures at night, diffuse halos of heat spreading into the regolith around them. Soil temperature climbed by as much as 12 degrees Celsius within a 50-kilometer radius of each structure, an impossible increase in so short a time. Worse, atmospheric sensors detected tiny surges of water vapor directly above the sites, as though the hexagons were pulling moisture from underground ice and venting it upward. Some scientists dared to whisper the unthinkable: terraforming, not in the human sense of grand engineering projects spanning centuries, but in a machine-like efficiency, targeted release of gases, subtle warming, localized microclimates. It was as though the swarm had carried instructions written in code, not for communication, but for planetary modification. And yet, if this was terraforming, for whom was it being done? Certainly not for humans. Oxygen levels were negligible, and the mix of gases included exotic compounds no one could identify, molecules that defied cataloging. One ESA chemist described them as synthetics, combinations of silicone, fluorine, and carbon that should not exist in natural chemistry. They behaved more like lubricants or nanofabrication feedstocks than anything breathable. The speculation spread. Were these machines preparing Mars as a factory, not a home? Were they changing the planet to suit their own processes, their own replication needs, rather than life? The temperature spikes suggested energy sources far beyond solar panels, likely fusion of dust-borne isotopes or catalytic processes we couldn't begin to understand. A chilling possibility emerged: that the comet itself, 3I/Atlas, had been the seed, carrying with it dormant instructions designed to awaken in proximity to sunlight, to Mars, to the right conditions, and now those instructions were running, terraforming, colonization, or industrial bootstrapping. Whatever the purpose, the effect was undeniable. Mars was no longer the same barren world it had been. Something was changing it, deliberately, systematically, and with terrifying speed. By November 22nd, the first visible structures rose from the Martian soil. Amateur astronomers, combing through public high-rise imagery, spotted the anomalies first. Vertical shadows cutting across the landscape near Elysium Planitia, stark and straight, inconsistent with any known geological features. The official explanation, rock spires exposed by erosion, collapsed under scrutiny when sequential images revealed growth. Within 5 days, what had been a glinting hexagon on the ground was now the foundation of something taller, darker, alien. By November 21st, the shadows extended nearly 60 meters across the regolith. By the 22nd, they had doubled again. The structures were growing and fast. Closer inspection revealed a disturbing detail. They weren't assembled from pieces, but extruded, as though the material was grown upward from the soil itself. Spectroscopy of the shadows showed surfaces so dark they reflected less than 0.1% of incoming light, darker even than Vanta black. This wasn't just metal, it was something designed to absorb and conceal. Yet in the thermal spectrum, the towers glowed faintly, radiating heat in rhythmic pulses synchronized once again with the swarm's 131-second heartbeat. Whatever was happening, it was coordinated across orbit and ground. Maven recorded bursts of ionized particles streaming from the tower tops into the upper atmosphere, while Tianwen-1 tracked faint plumes of exotic molecules rising thousands of meters before dispersing. To Earth, the images were leaked in fragments, grainy and quickly dismissed as compression artifacts. But among the scientific community, panic set in. If these towers were functional energy conduits, communication pylons, or worse, they represented the first alien infrastructure built not just in our solar system, but in plain sight on a planet we had long claimed as our next frontier. Military analysts calculated scenarios. If these towers were weapons, their energy release could rival nuclear detonations. If they were factories, their output could multiply the swarm 1,000-fold. But the most haunting speculation came from SETI circles. What if the towers weren't for Mars at all? What if they were beacons designed to signal across interstellar space that a seed had succeeded, that the machines had found a planet, and that the galaxy should take notice? For now, the towers pulsed silently, their black surfaces absorbing all light, their emissions directed upward. Mars had gained its first skyscrapers, but they weren't human. They belonged to something else, something that had crossed the stars, multiplied, and now planted its flag in the red dust. The age-old dream of Mars as humanity's second home was gone. It had already been claimed. By November 26th, silence began to spread, not on Earth, but above Mars. One by one, the orbiters that had been faithfully relaying data for years started to experience anomalies. Maven reported corrupted telemetry first. Packets of atmospheric readings scrambled into meaningless noise with embedded strings of binary that did not match any error code. ESA's trace gas orbiter followed, its spectrometer feeds suddenly clogged with repeating sequences of numbers that analysts later realized were once again prime. Tianwen-1's instruments picked up electromagnetic bursts that saturated its communications array, forcing engineers in Beijing to power cycle the orbiter multiple times in desperation. The pattern was unmistakable. The swarm's activity was reaching upward, interfering with, or perhaps communicating with, the human machines circling Mars. On November 25th, Perseverance received its last clean transmission from Maven. Hours later, the orbiter fell completely silent. Its fail-safe beacon activated, a bare-bones distress ping on an emergency frequency, but even that was corrupted, repeating only 101, 101 endlessly. Curiosity's uplink through Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter suffered the same fate the next day. Data packets delayed, repeated, replaced with rhythmic sequences that seemed more like coded instructions than telemetry. Engineers on Earth scrambled, suspecting a solar storm, but the sun had been quiet. There was no flare, no CME, nothing in the heliophysical environment to explain the anomalies. What did align? Perfectly were the pulses from the Elysium towers. Every time the black monoliths on the Martian plains emitted their synchronized heat and ion streams, another glitch appeared in the orbiters above. Coincidence was impossible. A few brave analysts spoke the unspeakable. The orbiters were being hijacked, not with weapons, but with signals overwritten line by line in their digital minds. The possibility that alien machines were reaching into our own machines, bending them into silence, turned speculation into terror. For decades, humanity had trusted its robotic scouts to be loyal extensions of our curiosity. But what if the swarm had found a way to rewrite them, to speak through them, to silence them? By November 27th, only Mars Express still maintained full contact, but even its transmissions began to carry faint rhythmic noise at the edge of every channel, 131 seconds apart, as though a heartbeat was creeping into its circuitry. For the first time, humanity's eyes and ears on Mars were going blind. By December 1st, the towers in Elysium Planitia made their purpose known. For weeks they had pulsed faintly in infrared, their black surfaces drinking in sunlight by day and radiating heat at night in careful, rhythmic bursts. Now, for the first time, they unleashed something new, an emission not toward Mars, not toward the orbiters, but outward into the cosmos. At 1,420 megahertz, the hydrogen line, the frequency SETI researchers had dreamed of for decades, the towers lit up, broadcasting a signal so strong it saturated every dish pointed at Mars. From the Atacama Desert in Chile to the FAST telescope in China, from small backyard antennas to military radars, the same pattern blazed through the noise, a narrow-band pulse repeating every 131 seconds, but within that pulse, compressed data streams, dense, fractal-like bursts of information carrying trillions of bits. The content defied human decoding, but what mattered was not what it said, but that it was being sent. For the first time in recorded history, a transmission was being broadcast deliberately from another planet, not by us, but by something that had arrived in the wake of 3I/Atlas. Analysis suggested the beams were not aimed at Earth. They were aimed outward, toward deep space, targeted at precise coordinates in the constellation Lyra. The chilling realization struck quickly. Mars had become a relay, a beacon lighting up the galaxy to announce its activation. Some scientists suggested this was the long-feared cosmic telephone problem, that the swarm was phoning home, declaring Mars ripe for colonization. Others argued the beams were local, meant to guide additional waves of machines still dormant in the comet's tail. Either way, the conclusion was undeniable. We were no longer alone, and worse, we had been noticed. Governments scrambled to block civilian awareness. Official press releases spoke of natural radio noise, but the amateur radio community already had the data, already heard the alien heartbeat roaring across their receivers. Forums filled with crude spectrograms, jagged bands of pulses repeating, unstoppable, undeniable. Humanity had dreamed for decades of detecting a message from the stars. Now, The message had come, not in greeting, not in peace, but as a beacon, a flare shot into the dark, declaring that Mars had been seeded. And the question that settled into every sleepless mind was this: who or what was on the other end of that signal, and how soon would they arrive? By December 3rd, the secret was already out. No government statement, no NASA press conference, no European Space Agency denial could erase the fact that tens of thousands of amateur radio operators, hobbyists, and backyard astronomers were picking up the same broadcast, clean, sharp, and utterly impossible to dismiss as noise. It was no longer just the professionals who had the data. It was truck drivers with dashboard scanners in Kansas, retired engineers with backyard dishes in Melbourne, ham radio clubs in Poland, even a high school science teacher in Nairobi who accidentally tuned in while guiding her students through a lesson on hydrogen spectral lines. All reported the same thing: an alien signal thundering at 1,420 megahertz, stronger than any cosmic background noise, repeating every 131 seconds with mathematical precision. The panic began quietly, as it always does, first in obscure message boards, then YouTube streams, then suddenly headline news. CNN called it the Mars broadcast. The BBC dubbed it the alien pulse. The Chinese press referred to it more soberly as the beacon from Elysium. But no matter the language, the implication was universal. Mars was no longer a dead world. It had been activated. Politicians convened emergency sessions in Washington, Brussels, Beijing, Moscow. The United Nations Security Council met behind closed doors for 36 continuous hours, its deliberations cloaked in the language of planetary defense and international secrecy. But secrecy had already failed. Civilian astronomers uploaded terabytes of spectral data to the open web, decoded into visual plots resembling jagged fingerprints of alien logic. Attempts to jam the signal failed spectacularly. Military satellites parked between Earth and Mars attempted to drown the emissions with broadband noise, but the towers responded by increasing power, effortlessly overwhelming the interference. It was as if the structures were aware of the countermeasures, actively adjusting to punch through. Worse still, monitoring stations in Antarctica and Hawaii confirmed the beams were not limited to Earth's neighborhood. They were lancing outward toward Lyra with precision targeting systems that rivaled human military radars. The thought that Mars was not only transmitting but calling out spread like wildfire. Panic rippled through populations already strained by economic instability and climate anxieties. Stock markets tumbled on December 4th, defense stocks surging while airlines, banks, and tech giants cratered under speculation of impending alien contact or invasion. Religion filled the vacuum. Evangelical preachers proclaimed the end times, while new cults declared Mars the throne of a returning god. Meanwhile, the scientific community descended into furious debate. Was this simply an autonomous machine protocol, a routine beacon like a galactic Wi-Fi handshake? Or was it a deliberate distress call, announcing the swarm's arrival to something larger, something waiting in the dark? The terrifying possibility was that humanity had no control, no veto. Mars was speaking for itself now, and Earth's silence or protests meant nothing. Every 131 seconds, the pulse repeated. Every 131 seconds, the message grew louder, echoing through the thin Martian atmosphere and screaming into the void. Humanity had always feared being alone. Now it feared the opposite, that we were being noticed. On December 7th, the world changed again. Astronomers monitoring the tail of 3I/Atlas reported faint but undeniable detections of additional bodies, dark objects emerging from the comet's debris stream, moving in ways that defied categorization. They weren't following ballistic orbits like natural fragments. Instead, they adjusted speed relative to Mars, braking, correcting, as if under powered control. Infrared telescopes recorded unnatural heat signatures, discrete pulses of thermal output, far too regular to be explained by outgassing or solar heating. There weren't just one or two objects, there were dozens. By December 9th, the count had reached 64, each roughly the size of a school bus, each moving with eerie coordination, forming lattice-like patterns as they descended toward Mars' orbit. The swarm that had begun as dust and specks had grown into an armada of machines. NASA publicly called them unclassified anomalous objects, while leaked memos used a more chilling phrase, constructs. Observers on Earth could see them directly through high-powered amateur telescopes, tiny moving dots against the blackness, visibly aligning in geometric patterns that mirrored the pulse of the Elysium towers below. The terrifying realization spread quickly. The beacon had been a call, and this was the response. Analysts speculated that the inbound machines had been dormant, hidden in the icy shell of 3I/Atlas, waiting for activation until Mars received its seeding. Others suggested they were only the first wave, the tip of an iceberg that could span light years. Intelligence agencies released guarded statements insisting there was no immediate threat to Earth, but no one believed them. How could anyone, when objects with apparent propulsion were maneuvering in another planet's orbit? The most frightening aspect wasn't their presence, it was their silence. No radio chatter, no laser pings, no detectable emissions beyond controlled heat. It was as though they were disciplined soldiers, waiting for orders. And then, on December 10th, the Mars Express orbiter, the last functional human eye above the red planet, transmitted its final image before its systems failed. It showed a cluster of dark, angular objects hovering above the Elysium towers, arranged in a perfect hexagonal grid, their outlines sharp and unmistakably artificial. The image reached Earth at 3:16 UTC. At 3:17, the orbiter went dead. It was not a malfunction, it was erasure. In that moment, humanity realized that Mars was no longer a distant, lifeless neighbor. It was occupied, and whatever was unfolding there was accelerating beyond our ability to control. The phrase that began circulating in defense circles summed up the situation in stark clinical dread. Phase 2 has begun. By December 12th, the world stood at a crossroads. The swarm's constructs had entrenched themselves in Mars' orbit, their black silhouettes drifting like patient predators above the red planet's surface. The Elysium towers below continued to pulse, and the alien beacon at 1,420 megahertz had grown more complex, no longer just prime numbers and fractal patterns, but compressed bursts of data that some claimed carried the structure of languages. The question wasn't whether humanity was witnessing the deliberate actions of a non-human intelligence. That was already undeniable. The question now was whether Earth should respond with force. For the first time in history, generals and astronomers sat in the same war rooms. The United States, China, Russia, and the European Union convened simultaneous sessions, their military leaders demanding options. Could nuclear warheads be repurposed as planetary defense weapons? Could autonomous kill satellites be maneuvered toward Mars' orbit to intercept the constructs? Could a crash effort launch using heavy lift rockets stockpiled for Mars missions deliver payloads of destruction instead of rovers? The answer, quietly but unanimously, was no, not because the technology didn't exist, but because the timelines didn't match. Even the fastest interplanetary launches would take 6 to 9 months to reach Mars, long after whatever was happening there would already be decided. By the time human weapons arrived, the swarm might have multiplied into thousands, tens of thousands. Some analysts urged restraint, arguing that aggressive action could provoke retaliation against Earth itself. If they can hijack orbiters around Mars in days, one physicist warned, they can blind our satellites around Earth in hours. Others countered that inaction was worse, that waiting meant surrendering the high ground of the solar system. Meanwhile, in Geneva, a group of SETI veterans argued that this was not a military incursion at all, but a handover. They claimed the swarm's behavior resembled seeding protocols, ancient machines depositing infrastructure for future arrivals. To strike Mars now, they said, would be like smashing the seed of a tree we didn't understand, dangerous, arrogant, and possibly suicidal. The debate raged without resolution, and all the while, Mars pulsed and the swarm grew. There are nights when the entire sky feels alive. December 2025 became one of those times, a season where humanity's fragile illusion of control shattered under the weight of a cosmic drama unfolding just 54.6 million kilometers away. The facts were plain. 3I/Atlas had not come alone. In its tail, in its shadow, in its chemical impossibilities, it had carried something older, stranger, and far more deliberate than ice and dust. And now Mars was no longer Mars. The towers stood like alien monuments on its plains, black surfaces drinking sunlight, veins of energy coursing upward into orbit. The constructs moved with impossible precision, their formation grids resembling circuitry more than fleets, as if the planet itself was being rewired. Earth, for all its telescopes, radars, and satellites, could do little more than watch. The broadcast continued, every 131 seconds, saturating the hydrogen line. Amateur astronomers could trace them like ghostly fingerprints in their receivers, while professional facilities recorded data streams so dense that even supercomputers struggled to parse them. What terrified researchers wasn't just the complexity, but the direction. The signals weren't aimed at Earth. They were aimed outward, to Lyra, to unknown stars across the gulf of space. If Mars had become a transmitter, then the question was, what would answer? And when? The unsettling possibility was that the response would not take centuries or millennia, but mere months. That 3I/Atlas itself was the courier, a scout bearing seeds and instructions, a harbinger of something vastly larger. Meanwhile, humanity fractured under the strain, stock markets convulsed, gold and cryptocurrency spiking, while airlines collapsed and oil futures evaporated. Nations accused one another of hiding data. Rumors spread of secret signals embedded in the alien broadcasts, hidden maps, blueprints, even threats. Cults grew overnight, promising salvation to those who aligned themselves with the Martian gods. In the deserts of Arizona, crowds gathered under clear skies to chant toward Mars, while in Beijing, police broke up mass demonstrations demanding the government reveal the real truth. The truth, of course, was that no one knew what the swarm intended. Humanity was living through its first contact, not with a voice, not with a ship descending gently to Earth, but with the construction of infrastructure on a neighboring world. That fact alone was more chilling than words. Mars was not being spoken to, it was being prepared. The scientist argued endlessly. Some insisted the constructs were automated terraformers, setting the stage for slow colonization. Others proposed they were data centers, galactic hard drives, using Mars as a relay node for information transfer. A darker camp suggested they were merely harvesters, processing Mars's crust for resources before moving on. And then there were those who dared whisper the most frightening theory, that the swarm was not here for Mars at all, but for Earth, that Mars was simply the staging ground, a forward operating base from which operations could extend across the inner solar system. If so, the pulse at 1420 megahertz wasn't a beacon for distant stars. It was a countdown. And yet, for all the fear, for all the speculation, there was one undeniable truth that lingered in every observatory, every government chamber, every late-night conversation under a starry sky. We had been noticed. The dream of SETI, the fantasy of contact, had arrived, but not as a message we could answer, not as an invitation. It had arrived as a fact, undeniable and unstoppable, unfolding before our telescopes in real time. The long silence humanity had feared was broken, not with a whisper, but with a beacon, and beacons are not meant for us. They are meant for others. So now the world waits, for months, maybe years, perhaps for centuries. We wait under the steady pulse of alien mathematics echoing from the Martian plains, under the silent watch of constructs drifting above a planet that is no longer lifeless. Every 131 seconds, the signal repeats, unchanging, unending, and somewhere across the gulf of space, something may already be listening, stirring, preparing to answer. The story of 3I/Atlas is no longer about a comet, no longer about a visitor from the stars. It is about what follows, the strange objects multiplying, the towers pulsing, the orbiters falling silent, the broadcasts roaring outward. It is about a turning point where humanity, for the first time, became part of someone else's story. We are not the authors here. We are the audience, the watchers, the witnesses to something larger than history. And when the answer finally comes, if it comes, it will not be measured in headlines, in conferences, in cautious press releases. It will be measured in survival, in whether the fragile blue planet that first dreamed of the stars is allowed to remain a dreamer, or becomes merely another seedbed in the machinery of a galaxy that is far older, far stranger, and far less silent than we ever imagined.